I spent the last week in the archives in Ottawa, and for the first time ever in my 35 years of going to the archives, I had to go through security for reasons that you may or may not be familiar with. And I kept thinking about this presentation that I want to do with you today, and so I was mindful of looking at the material. I'm doing a study on morale in the Canadian Army during the Second World War, of which this discussion in film takes a small part. And I kept being reminded of the importance of film, as I'll try to convey to you in the next few minutes. But the first reference to a film that I thought was kind of fun was in a series, I'm not even sure what it was, a directorate of some kind. And at one point in 1943, this group of senior officers sat down and watched a film called Portraits of Canada. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And it was made by the United States Army VD collection, or VD people. And I thought, what a curious film, a VD film called The Portraits of Canada. I was curious. I haven't watched the film, but perhaps we'll find it. Film to me is fascinating, and this is the entree into the discussion. Comes in late 1943, when the Canadian Army's Director of Education nervously writes the English playwright Noel Coward, who was then in New York. And the letter came at the urging of the Army's Director General of Medical Services, Brock Chisholm, who Matthew mentioned was also a veteran of the Hill 70 battles of 1917. But in 1943, Brock Chisholm is wildly impressed by a film that some of you are no doubt familiar with, a film called In Which We Serve. And it was written, directed, and starred Noel Coward, who plays Captain Edward, should have made that a bit bigger, but he plays the captain of the doomed HMS Torrin. And Chisholm thought the film was an inspiration and stimulation for the Navy in particular and the British people in general. And in fact, through most of 1943, quite a number of efforts were made in Toronto to actually make sure that any member of the Canadian Navy would see In Which We Served. What Brock Chisholm wanted was something similar for the Canadian Army. And so he asked the Director of Education, who clearly was quite intimidated at writing in Noel Coward, as one might be. And he hoped, for instance, that an opening quotation from Robert Browning, in which he writes, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp," or what's a heaven for? He was trying desperately to impress this guy, and I think it was falling rather flat. But he was hoping to gain his interest. And he said that he was an official concerned with everything that a slew that contributes to the morale of the soldier or the citizen. And he admitted that the Army had employed a slew of psychiatrists, social scientists, educators to explore the problem of morale in the wartime Canadian Army. And he said, well, there's something wrong. We need a film. And there's a singular lack of emphasis, he said, on the intangible spiritual factors by which men live. And he hoped, he was disparaging, in fact, of an American training film called Baptism of Fire, that was intended to help soldiers deal with their fears in battle. But clearly, in his view and that of Brock Chisholm, this film did the opposite. He wanted something inspiring. He wanted something that would, he hoped, boost the morale of the Canadian Army. Now, we don't know if Coward replied. I'm betting pretty good money that he didn't. He was busy seeing another one of his famous plays, This Happy Breed, being put to film later that year. But the letter to me is suggestive for several reasons. First of all, it highlights the simple point that films were really important in the Second World War, and that might seem obvious, but I think that if anyone who looks through the record and even looks through newspapers of the time will recognize that film in so many different ways was a central part of the Canadian culture. And inevitably, would film become a central part of how we understood the war effort. It was important as well for not only the ranks themselves, but for civilians. That relationship between the military and civilian life is something that highlights in the films that I want to talk about. Certainly the Army's Director of Education held Coward's commercial wartime films in high esteem. In American instructional films, as I've mentioned, he views with some disdain. And of the American films about wartime Canada, he said nothing. Even more curious is that there's no mention of the films being produced by the fledgling National Film Board of Canada, which of course starts in 1939. And he doesn't mention much as well about a specific Army photo and film unit that's going to be created. Well, no, that is created by 1943. In the end, I suppose the Army's Directorate of Education was disappointed. There aren't, this is perhaps a spoiler alert, there are no Canadian wartime inspirational films of the kind created by Noel Coward that ever appeared on Canadian screens. We left that kind of, dare one say, blockbuster to the Americans and the British. Yet even at the time, some Canadian critics were at once pleased but also perplexed by how British and American filmmakers viewed wartime Canada. Canadian-made films, though, were, it seemed, problematic, at least from the Army's perspective. And again, that omission in the discussion that's raised with Noel Coward, I think, is quite significant. So what I want to talk about today is both what our Directorate of Education refers to and what he doesn't. Because I think these films tell us a great deal about the Canadian war effort generally and the Army specifically. Here's how I want to organize my talk today. I want to talk briefly about, well, one film that I've watched many, many times, as I'm sure you have, a British presentation made in 1941, and it was called The 49th Parallel. And it's a film about Canada made by British, quite famous British filmmakers. Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger are well known in the lexicon as quite dramatic filmmakers. And on one hand, it seems as if they've captured some essence of the Canadian wartime experience. But as I'll find, many Canadians, it seems, were disappointed by the effort. Then I want to turn to the National Film Board and the forms of presentation, which were by no means blockbusters, that were presented through two series. One was called Canada Carries On, which was a series of nearly 200 films which were produced by the NFB from 1940 all the way to 1959. It's an extraordinary collection of material that, despite its relatively low production value, something which is made worse by the fact that they've been reproduced not very well in various kinds of digital forms, I think there's really something about these films that, to me, are worth looking at for telling us something about the Canadian war effort and about how Canadians understood the Army, about the problems it faced, and about the kind of importance not only to the Army but to its reception within the public. Maybe that ties to the issues of the public issues of how we understand the heroism that Ryan referred to in his discussions of the VC winners. How they were presented to me is endlessly fascinating. And then I want to just turn very briefly in the time, because I know I'm separating you from a nice glass of libation at some point. I want to keep my comments to a minimum and to talk briefly about just the way in which some of these films might force us to ask different kinds of questions about the Canadian war effort, how it was perceived. And finally, I'll ask, in closing, what kind of films did the soldiers themselves like? Okay, so there's my task in the next few minutes. And I think in 2019, I didn't have to wear these glasses, so it shows you what has happened in the previous 3 years. So first, let's talk about this film. 49th Parallel is a film that comes out, premieres in London in October of 1941. Michael Powell directs. You might know that name. Emmerich Pressburger writes and wins the Oscar, in fact, for the best story of that time. Of course, for the benchmark of American filmmaking. And to me, it's a terrible film. And I've watched it for years, and I've made my students watch it, and they went, "Why are you making me watch this thing?" And then I suddenly realized why I wanted them to watch it. The whole premise is this. I'll try to be brief. And to amazing. It's actually Laurence Olivier's worst performance, I'm fairly sure. And you know, so for that reason alone, I suppose it's worth watching. The story is supposed to take us across Canada, and the filmmakers dedicate it to all Canadians and so on and so forth. But the film's not really geared towards the Canadians, it's geared towards the Americans, who are at that time neutral. And it's about a U-boat crew who are happily sinking merchant ships off the East Coast. Probably the most tame initial attack on a merchant ship one could ever imagine. And yet the RCAF kind of plays a prominent role because they drive the U-boat. Again, the sense of geography it overwhelms these filmmakers. They spent much of 1940 kind of filming all over Canada, and then they retreated to a series of English sound studios to write the kind of film the main scenes. But they end up in Hudson's Bay, where the submarine is caught or is destroyed. And so this crew of determined Nazis have to make their way to the neutral United States. This is where the geographic challenges come in, because they go south and then they go west. And, oh my God, it's quite extraordinary. They don't quite handle the geography of Canada. And so there are a series of vignettes. First with a group of Hutterites. Gwyneth Johns, of course, is in it, and Anton Wellberg acting as gentle Hutterites who have a debate with the Nazis about the nature of peace and love and so on and so forth. And each of these scenarios, no, excuse me, that's the second scenario. The first scenario is actually in a Hudson's Bay trading post where Laurence Olivier acts as Johnny, a French-Canadian trapper. Yeah, it's as bad as you can imagine. And Johnny is killed actually by the Nazis, but not before realizing the nature of the struggle ahead. And so then they go to see the Hutterites, and we lose a few more of the crew. And then there's about 2 or 3 left, and they head out west where they're caught by the RCMP at Banff National Park. Well done, Mounties. And I think, yeah, this is where the directional challenges really overwhelm them. And then there's a wonderful scene with Leslie Howard, who you may well know, who's killed in 1943, in fact, in which he presents himself as a sort of Canadian, historian, I guess, and he's sitting in a tent on the maybe beside Lake Louise, with his Monets and his Thomas Mann, and of course the ideological debate with the Nazis doesn't go very well, and they see him as effeminate and bourgeois and everything terrible, but of course he prevails, and that leaves only one, Eric Portman, the U-boat commander, to make his way in an extraordinary way back to southern Ontario. And by this time, both the British and Canadian and German press are either hailing him as a Nazi fugitive or as a great hero of the Reich. And the final scene to me is where I realized that it was important for my purposes to make sense of far too many viewings. And in the final scenes, it's a train, it's found on a freight train, and Eric Portman is about to take the freight train across the Niagara River to Niagara Falls, New York, and he meets up with Andy Brock. And Andy Brock is played by Raymond Massey, who of course had been quite a prominent member of the Massey family, and who was perhaps best known up to that time portraying Abe Lincoln. And Andy Brock is the only time he played a Canadian, in which they again have a series of exchanges in which Andy Brock says, well, you know, I'm sick of the army, and I managed to, you know, go AWOL, and I want to get out. And of course, this seems to be a premise for Eric Portman to convey the virtues of National Socialism, and Andy Brock is finally overcome. He's stripped down to his underwear, and Eric Portman takes the U-boat commander takes his uniform, and off he goes. And it's not until the very end, of course, when Andy Brock, Raymond Massey, realizes the nature of the struggle, and after convincing the U.S. border agents to send them back across to the Canadian side, he says, his final scene, I'm paraphrasing, but it's marvelous. He says, "Come on, Nazi, put him up." And he says, "And I'm not just going to ask for those pants, I'm going to take them." And Raymond Massey by that time is a 40-year-old fellow. He doesn't look like he could take anybody, but off he goes. So it was marvelous. It seemed to be a great, exciting moment. But the Toronto Star film critic says, there's something wrong with this film. I'm disappointed in it. And I'm again paraphrasing, in which he says, it's a film that has nothing to do with Canada. And there were a great many expectations that this film was about Canada, with all these events being closely followed as the film crews made their way across the country. And he said, there's just something wrong with this film. There's nothing here that doesn't look like it's been part of a 1930s promotional tour. So there was a sense here that I think even a film which was wildly successful in Britain just didn't seem to catch anything about the Canadian wartime experience. And I suppose most importantly, for my purposes, it must have made the Canadian Army officials cringe that Andy Brock represents this guy who's stripped down to his underwear by a Nazi. And if you're looking for public relations, this was not the place to find it. If you're looking for public relations, the Army could have taken something from the RCAF, who very soon after, in January of 1942, makes sure that copies of this film, Captains of the Clouds, is premiering in Ottawa, Vancouver, and Toronto, and they make sure that the copies of the film are available by RCAF ferry so that it would coincide with the premieres in New York and London. And there was a great deal of pride in the papers. You can tell that the RCAF is making this into a public relations coup by bragging that they've consulted on the film and have been a central part of it. And of course, having Billy Bishop, VC, as a cameo in this film seems to be a great way in which the RCAF seems far better at publicizing itself than the dear old Army. Maybe I'll mention the uniforms. Take a look. There's RCAF on the right, Navy in the middle, and that scratchy old Don Army uniform. It's amazing to me the numbers of people who said, I don't want to join the Army in 1942 because the uniform is lousy and nobody wants to dance with me. Because the Navy and the RCAF has really nice tailored uniforms and we have to wear that awful, scratchy wool stuff. Big element of how the Canadian Army had to kind of deal with this stuff. Captains of the Clouds, though, if ever you've watched it, is also, to me, a disappointing film. Jimmy Cagney does far better in another film that year. I'm sure Canadians would have agreed as well. It was a film that he played George M. Cohan and won the Oscar for Yankee Doodle Dandy. So to play a Canadian bush pilot, much of the film was filmed in North Bay, Ontario, but it too lacks a certain sense, a Canadian sensitivity, and it causes a great deal of rioting laughter, they say in the RCAF message when they have these various nightclub scenes. And they said there are no nightclubs in Ontario in wartime. It just doesn't happen. So they, again, that sense that we were at once pleased but perplexed by this attention given to us from the British and the Americans. So what about the National Film Board? I like this picture of John Grierson, who both invents and leads the National Film Board after it's created in 1939. Grierson is quite an extraordinary figure, and that photograph to me suggests both the kind of charismatic attraction that he had for some, as well as the kind of fear he struck in people like Mackenzie King, who seemed quite intimidated by John Grierson. A Scot, Calvinist background, First World War veteran, and who very early on in the 1920s and 30s begins creating what we know and indeed defines the word documentary. And so he works for the General Post Office in the 1920s and 30s, largely runs into trouble, which is why he ends up coming to Canada and to create the National Film Board. And it's from there then that John Grierson helps create this program called Canada Carries On. It was a series of short films, none of them were more than about 20 minutes long, some of them were as short as 8 or 9 minutes, that were often intended to be shown before the main feature. And for those of us that think we're movie nuts, take a look at the wartime newspapers of, say, the Toronto Star, and count the number of movie theaters in Toronto at that time. They are far exceeding a city now of far bigger size. People went to the movies. That was their diversion, that was their source of news, it was a source of entertainment, it was, again, it just simply reminds me, anyway, of the way in which film was seen as a form of entertainment, of morale building, of propaganda, of instruction, all kinds of things. Canada Carries On has been looked at in some way by some scholars, but I think the content of it is well worth re-examining for what it might tell us about the Army and about Army morale. The 3 films I'll talk about I should mention this too. One of the elements that Grierson draws in here is the element of trying to bring women into the armed forces through the course of war. The CWACs and the WDs and the Naval Reserve, or the Women's Naval Reserve, are all created in 1940 and 41. And the Canada Carries On series then begins to try to convey something about what impact and what contribution women will make in uniforms through the course of the war. Even more interesting is the fact that the director, the screenwriter, in some ways even the producer of these films is Jane Marsh, a woman who runs afoul, it seems, of Grierson eventually, and will leave the NFB and go off and work for the British in New York, if I understand that right. But again, the students that I've always watched or tried to make them watch these films, they're still terrific. They're still widely, even more available than they've ever been because of YouTube and various other streaming sites. They're really important for trying to understand the significance of the women's, how people negotiated women coming into the armed forces for the first time. And my students are constantly telling me, oh, this is, such traditional stuff, and I keep saying, no, it isn't. In 1942, to see a young woman in uniform was revolutionary, and I'm fascinated always at the way in which these films by Jean Marsh were trying to convey something about that problem. Gender plays a role here, because each of the 3 films that I'm just going to touch on very briefly here, because I know I'm keeping you from your whiskey, are what were called letters films. And this is one of the first ones that were made. Letter from Aldershot is produced in 1940, and there are 2 other films with letter in the title, Letter from Camp Borden, and in 1943, Letter from Overseas. And each of them use a very similar device. They begin by showing a young soldier, whether in Aldershot or in Camp Borden or elsewhere, sitting down and writing a letter to his mother. And each of the letters then are intended, I think, to reassure parents, especially mothers, to try to convince them that the Army is a safe place for their sons. That sounds curious, but when one looks at these films, and Letters from Aldershot, to me comes out at a time when the Canadians the 1st Division goes off to the UK in late 1939, and so they're the 39ers, they're the ones who are going to be there the longest. And Letter from Aldershot, I think, is a response to the fact that the Canadian morale at Aldershot, which is an old base created during the Crimean War, west of London, is a disaster for the Canadians. They hate the place. It's cold, it's miserable. The people in Aldershot are used to soldiers, so there's no happy welcome for the Canadians who march by. And when one looks at the kind of problem that the Canadians face along with everyone else in Britain in 1940, it's clear that the strategic picture is a pretty disastrous one as well. Not only that, there are, the first signs, for instance, that the Canadians absolutely hate the British food. Yeah. They hate mutton. I'm sure Jamie Martin's here, your father, I'm sure we had long conversations. I never spoke to any veteran of the Canadian Army who spent any time in England who said anything but this was the worst goddamn thing I've ever eaten. It was mutton. So the film Letter from Aldershot is this kind of brief capsule picture postcard, I suppose, to A, to try to convince soldiers to write home, which is enormously important, and B, it seemed to be to reassure parents, especially mothers, that the food was good, that the training was good, that they were being entertained, and that they were having that connection back to Canada. The same goes for a film made the next year, Letter from Camp Borden. Sorry, my graphics are nearly as impressive as my predecessors, so forgive me. But Letter from Camp Borden comes in 1941 after a massive expansion of the wartime Canadian Army all across the country in response to, obviously, the strategic situation in which Canadians suddenly find themselves in an enormously important role, both in the defense of Britain and later on in more offensive actions. And so this film, again, is another letter format. Young guys writing home, the narrators seem to be writing back to their mothers, talking about not only the military challenges at Camp Borden, but also the opportunities to get involved in motorcycles and truck training and various elements of the wartime experience. It was as if by 1941, the big sell for the Army, again against the Navy and the Air Force, was that it was like a giant trade school. And that was a big opportunity, it seemed, for many young Canadian men to join the Army because they could learn a trade. For the parents, it's all about the food, it's all about the camaraderie, it's all about trying to show that they're clean, young, healthy kids. And again, the kind of moral scare about men in the Army is really quite profound, not only in English, but especially in French Canada. Letter from Overseas is technically not part of the Canada Carries On series, but these films are coming out about once a month. And Grusin was a real taskmaster. He would send his guys out, and they had very little in the way of technical equipment. The sound is pretty iffy. Many of it's filmed on location. They use an enormous amount of stock video or stock footage from Germany, which they somehow capture in Bermuda for reasons that I've yet to discover. But Letter from Overseas is 1943, and again, the Canadians have been there for a great many months, over 3 years in the case of the 1st Division. And again, it's an attempt to try to convey something about and to reassure the families back home that they were getting trained, that they were being well looked after. And I guess I could say that in my own studies of morale, it does seem as if the Canadians do very well in looking after themselves, that they create an infrastructure, to use a modern phrase, to try to keep fellows well fed, well entertained, they hope as far away from brothels and so on as they can, although Canadians managed to fail in that. The piece here, which doesn't show up again very well, again, it's this whole series of exchanges. Some of them are beautifully written. And this is the parents of this one soldier writing home, and they're reading this letter. And the whole premise of this film is that the young guy is writing a letter basically saying everything's fine. Everyone's great. I'm having a great time. Please send socks. And yet then the film itself shows that in fact he's doing much more. He's training, he's meeting the king and queen on their regular series of inspections. They're involved in the British society and so on and so forth. Again, lots of criticisms about how badly Canadians are behaving in Britain. But the final scene then is this exchange. The father comes home and says, you know, you got a letter from our son, that's terrific. And she says, yeah, nothing seems to be going. And then he kind of looks and he says, I wonder. I know someone else is wondering too. And she says, who's that? And then he turns full frame to the camera. Hitler, you know? It's as if, my God, the Canadians are getting ready to meet the foe. It's a brilliant little piece, though, that again reinforces these ideas about the impact of the relationship between the home front and the lads overseas. This film, again, most of this stuff now, I think the archives has put all of these newsreels on YouTube, so it really does become a great study for us and fairly simple in these times. This was a separate unit that Grusin in some ways not represented, he resented, because he wanted to have control of all the Canadian filmmaking. And the Canadian Army Film Unit, established in 1941, is separate from, and remains separate from, Grierson's ever-increased kind of bureaucratic control. Grierson takes over the Wartime Information Board by 1942, so his grasp is fairly significant. These are a very different kind of film. We would call them newsreels now, very short little vignettes announcing and showing various kinds of features that all of them wouldn't take any more than about 5 or 10 minutes. Again, these were what people looked at as before the big blockbusters came up. And there was a great deal of writing in magazines like Maclean's that these were really good. You know, they had a Canadian sensibility to them. There was something about a Canadian soldier and a Canadian narrative and Canadian humor, Canadian accents that seemed to resonate with audiences. And they had a big audience. By Canada Carries On, 800 for the first 6 months before it kind of went into a secondary series of theaters like YMCA's and church basements. The Canada Carries On series is showing in about 800 film theaters across the country. Canada Army Newsreel #1 first comes out in the fall of 1942. I'll be quick. And it's a series, and you're going, oh, here we go again. And they're showing, you know, General McNaughton, sorry, Andy, you know, inspecting troops and various kinds of inspections, which you go, okay, that's great. And it also has, to me, one of the most famous shots. This is, it begins with the visit of J.L. Ralston, who's the Minister of National Defense, who comes to inspect the troops and to talk, obviously, about matters in the fall of 1942. And this little segment has been repeated many times, but they're clearly showing him what looks like a battle drill site. And, you know, J.L. Ralston is a 60-some-odd old guy wearing a suit, having just gotten off a bomber flown across the Atlantic, and they hand him a rope and say, jump across that ditch. And he almost doesn't make it. You know, you could see there's a look of trepidation on his face, which I thought may or may not have been, you know, intentional to show poor J.L. Ralston in the worst possible light. In the seconds that follow, a very adept staff officer grabs him and brings him to his feet to avoid any further embarrassment. All of which is to say, okay, you know, yeah, there's visiting dignitaries and people shaking hands and troops parading and so on and so forth. And then the final clip of this first newsreel is very makeshift. And it's clear that what's happened was that the film unit has found out, I don't know why they didn't know this before, that the Canadian survivors of the Dieppe raid are going to be decorated at Buckingham Palace. And this is about October of 1942. Remember, Dieppe happens in August of 1942. And so what follows is a very hasty kind of presentation, short clips of showing these lads coming out of Buckingham Palace with their DSOs and their MCs and their MMs and DCMs. And to me, it's enormously important, and perhaps I'm overplaying this, but I really do think that one of the things that we do in understanding the Canadian Army is to continue to ask a series of questions which are only informed by hindsight. And rather than ask the perpetual question of, oh my gosh, how could we have possibly been involved in the Dieppe raid at such great cost, why not ask the question, which this film I think helps answer, why don't we ask, how did people at the time understand the Dieppe raid? And it may well be a cynical view to say, well, this is just propaganda, but it's amazing to me the degree to which this film, I would imagine, gives us a very different perspective about the Canadian Army. And I'll even make the case in my book, and you can shoot me down, that the Dieppe raid was really good for morale in the Canadian Army. After 2.5 years of inaction, these lads are up there and they fought Germans in France. And to see that kind of parade of heroes honored, I suppose, which is the title of that clip, makes us, I think it forces us to think something else about the Canadian Army and how it's understood. So to me, these films in a variety of ways help us ask new questions, which is what new perspectives in military history, it's what we're supposed to do. Okay, so what do the troops want? Well, one of the things that anyone who's studying morale will find is that you can cheat, because the Army was deeply concerned with morale, and so they monitored everyone. And the degree to which the Canadian state was a surveillance state during the Second World War is something that I'm slowly coming to grips with. And they monitored mail. They monitored everything that any soldier ever wrote to make sure that they weren't breaching any official secrets. They couldn't say where they were. They couldn't talk about details for fear that they'd fall into the hands of the Germans. And they realized very quickly that very few soldiers were stupid enough to write such details. So they realized they had a whole group of censors sitting in England, all probably wanting to save their jobs. They could have been dispatched and done other more useful things. And so they began to monitor mail to simply gauge the level of morale. And these reports come out every 2 weeks. They're quite extraordinary. And they ask them about film. So to me, this particular comment from November of 1944, I don't want to watch Captain Blood. That's an old Errol Flynn swashbuckler from the late 30s. I want, what does he say? I want a Bing Crosby picture. And I suspect that this crowd might know who Bing Crosby is. Who the heck wants to see a Blood and Thunder picture? What we want is music, songs, and cows. And so to me, you know, where do we go here? Oh hell, sorry, I jumped ahead. To me, you know, I spoke, I think, a couple of years ago here about the anti-hero. And I think there's a great deal to be said about the kind of way in which the sense of heroism that's perhaps embodied in the VC. Hopefully most soldiers wouldn't see themselves as VCs, as VC winners. They saw themselves as just everyday folk who wanted to get through the war and return home as quickly as possible. And so for them, pictures like Bing Crosby and Bob Hope's Road to Singapore in 1940 seemed to fit the bill really well. It wasn't about the kind of heroism that perhaps some of us have been watching in wartime films ever since. I know my father's favorite film was The Guns of Navarone. How many times have I watched The Guns of Navarone? You know, these young commandos under Gregory Peck scaling the mountains in Greece. For them, the soldiers at the time perhaps understood The Road to Singapore as a light release. It gave them some sense, perhaps, of their own vision of themselves and how they wanted to get home. Lots more to discuss. I'll leave you there. Thank you for your time.